This is the Lian Li Lancool 217. This is a $120 to $125 case. It's in the modern budget range of cases. Once again, has strange fans on the front. These are 170s. So they're using two 170s with these plastic spacers that can be used as GPU or CPU cooling offsets. We'll talk about that today. Internally, the case also comes with 3 more fans. And then these are interesting because they're using 11 blade fans here. And the reasoning for that, I think, is probably because they need the extra pressure because they can only really pull in through these side perforated panels. So the lower quarter panel on this side of the case, and then on the other side of the case, for the back panel, they've punctured it here as well. So that is the only set of places air can come from for those shroud top fans. There's nothing coming in through the bottom down here. It's all just solid steel. It's not that far from the table. And the power supply has the usual holes for the power supply to breathe. One interesting thing, though, is that these two shroud top fans, they can be sort of relocated and mounted internal to the shroud. And that would take away some space. So for example, we would lose the extra access for some of the drive support, for power supply, sizing support, and for cables, but it also gets it a little bit closer to the intake for the air. And then finally, there is a third position in here for a third fan right on top of the power supply. This is functionally useless. It's not gonna be able to pull any air in. We think the only reason that's there is probably to support Lian Li's own 3 unit fans that they sell packs of 3 of, because that is how Lian Li has gotten incredibly wealthy. It is 3 unit fans, basically. 4 of the 5 case fans are mounted toollessly, and the front fans in particular can be rearranged into CPU mode or GPU mode with plastic spacers in between. We've tested these in our thermal testing today. Lian Li also included a full set of longer screws to make the toolless mounting system work specifically with the 28mm thick unit fans. And 5 years ago, Lian Li's Lancool 215 launched. At the time, it was groundbreaking, mostly due to the 2 200mm intake fans, generally only found on larger, expensive cases at the time, but it had a brutally low MSRP of $70, achieved by contracting out case production to existing tooling. And that put a lot of pressure on the rest of the industry. The $120 to $125 price for the 217 isn't as unbelievably low as the 215's was, but Lian Li has preserved several features of the 21X series. The case also has a 90-degree rotated power supply mount and an elaborate vertical GPU mount that's compatible with shroud top fans for once, although it requires a separately purchased riser cable to use. So with that, let's get into the review of the 217. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duronaut thermal paste. Thermal Grizzly claims its Duronaut paste is intended for long-term stability and endurance, focusing on paste longevity in addition to the usual performance focus. Thermal Grizzly's Duronaut paste comes with applicators and spreaders, and ships in numerous tube sizes, aiming to provide a high-end paste for PC builds and daily driven overclocks by enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below. So wood's obviously been the trend for cases. Lian Li says that it's self-described contemporary wood accent, which sounds so much more tasteful than slapping wood on a case, is a tight tolerance design. And so to make this look good at all, they needed to get these corners flush. And so looking at how the wood mates to the wood, that, they say, is the challenge in manufacturing. They've managed to get them flush. On our sample, it actually looks pretty good for at least how the panels mate together. There aren't these gaps. But if you look at competing cases on the market, like the Fractal North, which really is the one that first successfully got wood into cases in a mainstream way, they typically use strips of wood, where if it's a little off one way or the other, you'll never know. And that's not going to be the case here. So Lian Li created some additional strain for themselves in manufacturing with it. And at least on ours, it looks okay. We haven't seen enough of them to know how they all came out. But we usually only see wood used as a decoration on cases, and on this one, the front panel actually seats flush into the wood at the bottom. We've seen the risks of using it as a functional element as well. So for example, the cracked panel on our Fractal Era 2 was an instance of wood not working out well. The arrangement of the trim on the Lancool 217 reminds us of the Antec Flux and the Flux Pro cases, which Lian Li may be targeting with the release of the 217. So let's start with the so-called CPU mode and GPU mode for the fans. This is something Lian Li has done in the past, but they've changed their execution this time. So these plates are basically 5 1/4 plates. They pull like that, and there's 2 of them. They can be used to block recirculation and just create a solid wall on the panel where the fans are not. Now the fans can readjust like this, so they're installed toollessly with rubber grommets. They can move into place, like with the hard drive cage installation approach, and then once they're slid back out of the socket, they can be fully removed and reseated, for example, up here. And then we would move this one where internally you can see there's a couple mount options here. So this fan could be repositioned upward, and that would help move both of the fans up towards the top of the case. And so doing that changes the airflow significantly, and we have results for that in our thermal testing later in this video. The case ships in GPU mode, meaning from top to bottom, the spacer, fan layout is what we get out of the box, with a bias towards airflow lower in the case. It can be reconfigured to CPU mode, meaning fan, spacer, with the fans higher up. This is similar in spirit to the so-called air cooling mode and water cooling mode configurations found on the Lancool 216, but more streamlined and practical and a lot easier to use. Now, alternatively, the case can fit 120s or 140s instead, and for that, they have a set of somewhat standard rails. So this comes with the case, and these rails are included. So these can be used to get 120s and 140s in the front of the case, but the entire point of the case is getting two large 170mm fans, and those can't be reused anywhere else. There's nowhere else to reposition in this, and so they'd basically end up just being waste for a future project. And they're part of the price. So with it being a large part of the price, we think it only really makes sense to buy this case if you intend to use those two front fans, even if you don't use any of the others. Making a vertical mount that's compatible with shroud-mounted fans is tricky, and Lian Li accomplished it with an elaborate collection of hardware. There's a tiny shroud extension at the front, so the fans can be shifted forward, another slightly larger extension at the back to mount a standoff to, and then the standoffs themselves. With all that in the accessory kit, it's unfortunately just not usable for a vertical GPU without a riser cable, which they don't include, but also a riser cable would very heavily impact the price. Now, welcome return from the 216 was the top removable radiator tray, where this tray can fit a 360 radiator in it. It slides out like that, has screws to hold it in place, and mounting a radiator anywhere else in the case is not really a viable option, mainly because you'd have to move the stock fans. And as soon as you start moving the front fans, you're losing most of the value of the case, and it doesn't make sense to put on top of the power supply shroud. Not a lot of air movement there, and also if the radiator ends up below the pump, that's not good either. But one of the cool things we found with this is because this whole area is so accessible now, by removing that radiator tray, pulling the fans completely from the front, we found, and especially if you're going to disconnect the cable, but we found that this gave excellent access to the case. The fan also serves as, the cable's sort of like a bungee cord. It's actually a safety cord. So, power supplies can be mounted in either standard mode for up to 220mm in length, or what they call rotated mode, the default, for up to 180mm in length. As with the Lancool 207, we suggest sticking to shorter 150mm power supplies in rotated mode to allow extra room for cable bends. If you use one of Lian Li's edge power supplies, it has to be mounted fan side up, and it'll compete with the GPU for air. Now, a fan and RGB hub is included with this, which is probably because they're trying to support the unifans, again, because this case does not have any RGB LEDs included. This supports 4 ARGB outputs and 6 fan outputs, and it's powered by SATA and 5 volts. The manual specifies which fans should be connected to each port, but we confirmed with a tachometer that fans run at the same speed regardless of which port is used. One kind of weird thing with this is there's actually 2 power buttons. So there's the top panel power button here, which corresponds with that switch. And then on the side panel, for where the actual I/O is, you can see there's another power button here. And they've wired this in a way where it's hardwired to the same I/O board. And so you can only use these buttons for power. You can't repurpose one of them. I mean, if you ripped out the wire and you redid the wiring, I guess you could repurpose it. But the reason they're doing this is because on the older Lancool cases like the 216, you had the option of moving the I/O, and that's gone with this, at least this version of the 217. And so to try and still offer power in multiple locations, they just offered power in multiple locations fixed. It's a little different, but Lian Li has already responded to some criticism of the 217, where some of the customers were unhappy that they couldn't relocate the I/O anymore. And for the 217 Infinity, which we saw at Computex, they do have 2 locations for I/O. There are 2 other features from the 216 that were dropped from this case. First, the unusual fan bracket that could be stuck over the rear expansion slot is gone. but our original testing didn't show any significant benefit to installing a fan there anyway. Secondly, Lian Li has dropped the screw from the glass panel, which is a nitpick that we'll always bring up. Glass panels should have a way to be fastened down securely, and especially for transit. The drive support is difficult to summarize on a spec sheet. There are two 2.5-inch mounts behind the motherboard tray, but only one of them can be used if an MATX or micro ATX back connect board is installed. There's another 2.5-inch mounting location on top of the power supply shroud if the rearmost slot for the fan isn't used. Finally, there are two traditional hard drive cages in the accessory kit that fit underneath the power supply shroud, each of which fits two drives in any combination of 3.5-inch and 2.5-inch. So sort of an if-then-else statement of drive support. This is unusually generous for a modern case, but keep in mind that only one drive cage will fit with the power supply in standard mode. The 217 includes the same flippable cable grommet bar that the 216 did. Rotating the bar gives clearance and exposes standoffs for SSI EEP boards up to 330 millimeters in width. Cable management space depends on the power supply orientation and drive cages, but the cable cutouts are large and aren't compromised as a result of back connect compatibility. Removing the small GPU support opens up another large cutout, although it lacks a rubber grommet. The plastic clips at the rear of the case from the 216 are back as well, making EPS 12-volt cable routing especially easy. One other note on build quality. So this piece is pretty fragile. When this shipped to us, this lower quarter panel of mesh was bent. It had a deformation in it. We were able to bend it back, so it's fixed now. But we think it was shipping damage. In this situation, the key takeaway is that although the steel itself is not crazy thin for the panel, it's completely punched through, I mean, basically all the way across. A little bit of support at the edges for structure, so it is a weaker panel as a result of that, and it's more prone to being damaged. All right, getting into the thermal testing. So there was some stuff included in the accessory kit, and one of them was this dust filter, which Lian Li says, quote, "If you need better performance, please do not install this filter," end quote. Based on this, we treated the filterless case as stock and ran one test with it installed as well. We also ran CPU mode, GPU mode as they name them, and a test with the GPU installed vertically in so-called GPU mode, although we were forced to install the GPU one slot closer to the glass than we wanted to, which is because of the length of the PCIe riser cable that we had. Fractal's recent Meshify 3 is an obvious point of comparison for the Lancool 217 with prices. They go down to $140, and our charted results are for the more expensive RGB variant of the Meshify 3, but performance should be similar between the Meshify 3 SKUs. Antec's Flux and Flux Pro may be the closest cases on the market in terms of both price and appearance, especially the non-Pro version of the Flux, to the point that it seems like an intentional strategy from Lian Li. But for now, we just have the Flux Pro on the charts. The Pro has a couple features that more closely match the 217, like its 3 available shroud top fan mounts and rotatable power supply, but the non-Pro is the one that matches the 217's price. Montech HS02 Pro that we reviewed is another case. With the mesh front, we generally preferred the glass-fronted HS02, but the HS01 Pro directly competes with the 217's market. And so with that, let's get into the thermal benchmarks. We'll start with noise-normalized thermals, where we use our hemianechoic chamber to measure the overall SPL of the case, and then lower the fan speeds in tandem until it hits our threshold of 27 dBA. Noise levels were slightly different in the 217's CPU mode and GPU mode, as we'll detail later on. So they require slightly different fan settings in order to hit the same threshold. With those adjustments, both configurations averaged 41 degrees Celsius above ambient across all cores and 45 degrees across the P cores. This is also exactly why we have the acoustic chamber. We wouldn't be able to pick up such small differences in noise before, and that slight adjustment shows that they're about the same for the CPU once we adjust for the RPM. The Meshify 3 placed higher on the chart than the 217, but its results were close enough to be basically equivalent at 40 degrees all core and 44 P core. Montech's HS01 Pro uses a bottom intake configuration and therefore has comparatively weak CPU thermals with our test hardware, averaging 49 all core. Meanwhile, the Antec Flux Pro matches the Lancool 217's thermal performance here almost exactly, although again the non-Pro variant is a closer match in price. Lian Li's older Lancool 216 also remains unbeaten here, with thermals that closely match the Meshify 3 and are therefore pretty close to the 217 as well. The 216 had highly unusual 160mm intake fans, especially at the time they were unusual, with extra wide frames to prevent air recirculation, We found them to be effective in our review, and that still holds up today. Looking at the GPU thermal data for the same set of noise-normalized results reveals a more significant gap between the case configurations. CPU mode is at 44 degrees above ambient for the average GPU temperature and 48 degrees for GPU memory, while GPU mode dropped that to 42 and 45 degrees respectively. Given that the previous chart showed CPU temperatures were unaffected, that makes GPU mode the better configuration overall for our test hardware. Although there are two intake fans directly below the GPU, biasing the front intake fans lower in the case has a chance to improve thermals even further. That lines up with what we generally found with the previous iteration of our test bench, where GPU thermals generally had more room for improvement than CPU in high airflow cases. GPU mode gave the 217 a slight advantage over the Meshify 3, although the delta was less than 1 degree, with the Meshify 3 averaging 43 degrees above ambient. The HS01 Pro ran similarly to the Meshify 3, and the Flux Pro landed on top at 41 degrees. The older 216 performed similarly to the HS01 Pro with a 43 degree average, which is to say it also performed similarly to the 217. All the results we've recorded for the 216 this time around are in stock configuration. In our original review, we found that the alternate air cooling mode slightly improved GPU thermals and slightly worsened CPU thermals with an old bench. Moving to the full speed test, the Lancool 217 is now the loudest case on this chart other than the Fractal North XL, measuring in at 44.8 dBA with all 5 fans running at their maximum speed, 44.3 for CPU mode as well. We'll skip right to the GPU thermals here, since CPU thermals were the same in all 4 tested configurations. As expected, the vertically mounted GPU test had the worst average at 47 degrees above ambient, followed by CPU mode at 43 degrees, and then GPU mode at 40 degrees. This would improve with a GPU in the slot closer to the board. Installing the front filter had no significant impact on thermals or noise in this test, which isn't something we see often, so Lian Li deserves some credit. Technically, the result with the filter installed had a slightly cooler average than without, but that's within our 1 degree margin for test variance, and the GPU memory temperature stayed at 41 degrees for both tests, so this is all within error. That means that the filter has minimal impact on GPU thermals in our test, so it isn't that obstructed, and again, that's good for Lian Li. The GPU mode 217 outperformed the Meshify 3 and HS01 Pro by about 1 degree, but it's also audibly louder than either of those cases, while the Flux Pro manages to be both cooler at 38 degrees and quieter at 39.7 dBA in comparison to the 217. This is the first test we've seen so far where the 217 puts a gap between itself and the 216, with the older 216 averaging 43 degrees above ambient. We would normally examine the VRM and RAM thermals from the noise-normalized results, but sticking with the full-speed chart instead allows us to see how the various configurations affected motherboard temperature. All 4 of the results for the VR-VCC sensors recorded for the 217 rank among the best we've seen, with CPU mode at 20 degrees above ambient, and both GPU mode results at 19, and the vertical GPU results at 17 degrees. Mounting the GPU vertically doesn't do the GPU itself any favors, but in the 217 it allows the bottom intake fans to blow directly up through the case without being blocked by the horizontal GPU cooler. Of course, this also means the air is not going straight into the GPU. SPD hub temperatures from the RAM were excellent here. The vertical GPU result also was on top at 10 degrees above ambient for the memory. And GPU temperatures are a higher priority, but motherboard temperatures are worth taking into account when evaluating vertical GPU mounts, which we're doing here. The Lancool 217 is not leaps and bounds ahead of the 216, for those of you who used the 216 in the past. But the 217, it does have logical improvements, and it's definitely making adjustments for case trends. Whether or not that matters to you is sort of a different story. And there is a lot of competition on the market. Overall, this is a good case. That doesn't mean it's the only option, and it's not our default choice, but it is a good case, all things together. So following trends like wood, back connect motherboard support, and supporting Lian Li's own new products like edge power supply, streamer cables, unifans, things like that, that is a lot of the case's purpose. The wooden decoration on the front panel is the most significant change. It's also very subjective, so that's up to you. But it's followed by the toolless fans, which make reconfiguration easier than it was in the 216. The 216 already had excellent thermal performance, and for the most part, the 217 simply matches it, only really pulling ahead when the case fans are all pushed to max speed, which is impractical due to noise. At $120, the 217 competes favorably with the similarly performing but more expensive $140 plus Meshify 3 from Fractal, although Fractal has options for RGB lighting. The fans and performance you get for the money push the 217 past Montech HS01 Pro, leaving the $120 Antec Flux Pro as the strongest contender. The 217 seems to be Lian Li's attempt to match the Flux Pro in performance and features, while matching the size and price of the non-Pro, and it's a success in those aspects. That said, the Flux Non-Pro is similar to the 217, and the comparison between the two comes down to some very specific items. The 217, for example, has excellent stock fans, more spare connections on its built-in fan hub, support for rotated power supplies, it fits SSI EEB motherboards, it can fit a greater number of drives, and it has some out-of-the-box support for vertical GPU mounting, although it does not include a riser cable, which you would need. The Flux has potentially better airflow at the bottom of the case due to its ventilated floor, and its fan layout is more reconfigurable since all of those stock fans are either 120s or 140s. Now, overall, the Flux and the 217, they're both good cases to consider. Patrick favors the 217 this case. And as far as what I think of it, I think it comes down also to what you're trying to fit in the case. It's like the Flux Pro, the biggest change really is the price. And it's like at least $40 more, often $60 more. That's the biggest difference between them. Performance-wise, this will get you most of that performance for, say, $40 to $80 cheaper, which is a big drop in price. You can put that money to something else, like a better cooler, for example, or just keep it. But that's the biggest difference. The Flux Pro also has some sizing advantages, and then the fans, again, being repositionable for being more standard, something to consider. But ultimately, both of them are very good cases, and right now, the sub $200 market, especially in cases, is extremely competitive. So that's it for the Lian Li Lancool 217 review. We like it overall. It is mechanically executed well, and the cooling is competitive. It's up at the top of the chart with a lot of other Lancool cases, so Lian Li has done well to maintain its position there. And that'll be it for this one. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.